Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday everybody. Chinese policymakers are facing several difficult medium to long-term systemic challenges that will impact their future economic growth, health and dynamism. However, as regular viewers know, China is also dealing with immediate short-term challenges too. Beijing has indicated that it needs to stabilize these first before moving to push through more painful and tricky reforms to deal with the longer-term issues. One of these immediate short-term challenges is youth unemployment, especially for recent graduates. As we have seen, official youth unemployment is once again creeping towards 20%, 1 in 5 young people, very high by modern PRC standards. We see here that the rate has almost doubled in just a few years during the pandemic. Yet another data point suggesting that the COVID years hurt the economy much more than the headline GDP numbers would suggest. With a record 11.6 million college graduates expected to enter the already tight labour market this year, the situation shows little signs of easing. A survey last November of 100 China-based employers by 51 Job found that more than half of respondents planned to reduce hiring in 2023, though we note this was taken before the ending of zero COVID. Whether savaged private corporate balance sheets can recover this year will be critical to whether the private sector can begin employing again. In a sign of just how concerned policymakers are, just one day after supporting policy for exports, the State Council, China's de facto cabinet, issued an announcement on measures to promote employment and offer support to the unemployed. Quote, China will optimize and adjust policies and measures for employment to promote development and benefit people's livelihoods. Enterprises that hire newly graduated college students, those still seeking jobs within 2 years of graduation, or people registered as unemployed aged from 16 to 24, and provide a contract for more than 1 year, will receive a one-off round of employment allowance. State-owned enterprises should hire more. Enterprises, public institutions, and social organizations should recruit no fewer than 1 million internship positions for the young. End quote. As we have discussed in previous videos, some analysts have expressed concern that SOEs and local governments soaking up millions of recent graduates risks pulling talented youth into the least productive and dynamic parts of the economy. There is also concern that local governments, facing acute fiscal pressures, which we have thoroughly explored in previous videos, need to be reducing their employee numbers, not increasing them. State media too has increasingly been promoting blue-collar work and working-class jobs, publishing more than a dozen profiles in recent weeks of recent university graduates who have made great income in low-skilled jobs. And, incredibly, when we consider the cultural tradition of East Asia generally, and China specifically, even arguing that not everyone needs to go to university. Of course, entitled graduates looking down their noses at manual work is not a phenomenon unique to China. It can be seen across the world, especially in developed economies. But in China, the sheer size of the skill mismatch and the lack of decent employment opportunities for young people is significant. Young, educated people have a disproportionate influence on social and political discourse, as well as intellectual trends. So, if this period of high youth unemployment continues, it could have lasting effects on the next generation's worldview. Quote, investing in education no longer guarantees a high return. That has undermined the basic idea of how ordinary people could climb the social ladder. End quote. And of course, it presents the real risk of social discontentment and even unrest. Next up, the worsening state of China-US relations. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's a huge help. A lot of work goes into these episodes, but with your guys' support, it always makes it worth it. Sharing, subscribing is a huge help as well. YouTube does have a tendency to unsubscribe regular viewers, so if you think you should be subscribed, maybe check this now. And as always, anyone who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is the best way to help me keep the channel going. As always, thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. US-China is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Every week we follow the most salient developments in these relations. Now let's move through the most recent updates. There is a lot to cover. Yesterday, Thursday, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave a speech at the Brookings Institute in Washington called, quote, "Renewing American Economic Leadership," end quote. And while it is not a China-specific speech, like Treasury Secretary Yellen gave last week, China was prominently featured. Interestingly, the National Security Advisor expressed that his administration is, quote, "for de-risking and diversifying, not decoupling," end quote, adopting the articulation of European Commission President von der Leyen from a few weeks ago. What does Sullivan mean by this distinction, though? He explains in his remarks, quote, "De-risking fundamentally means having resilient, effective supply chains and ensuring we cannot be subject to the coercion of any other country," end quote. Adding, quote, "Export controls are narrowly aimed at technology that could be used to tilt the military balance against the US rather than cutting off trade," end quote. This is similar to what Treasury Secretary Yellen said last week, and indeed US President Joe Biden during a joint press conference with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, who we know is visiting Washington this week, on Wednesday expressed, quote, "US technology export and investment controls wasn't designed to hurt China. It was designed to, so we didn't have to worry about whether or not we had access to semiconductors. We are not going to sit back and be in the position where we don't have access to those semiconductors," end quote. The theme was echoed once again by US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, who expressed to journalists this week, quote, "I stand by what I said last week, and it's been consistent across our administration. In terms of decoupling, it is not the goal, and decoupling is not practicable either as a goal," end quote. Now let's return to Sullivan's speech from yesterday. Quote, "We've implemented carefully tailored restrictions on the most advanced semiconductor technology exports to China. These restrictions are premised on straightforward national security concerns. We are also enhancing the screening of foreign investments in critical areas relevant to national security. The United States continues to have a very substantial trade and investment relationship with China. Bilateral trade between the United States and China set a new record last year. We are competing with China on multiple dimensions, but we are not looking for confrontational conflict. We are looking to manage competition responsibly and seeking to work together with China where we can, like in climate, like macroeconomic stability, health security, and food security. We can defend our national security interests, have a healthy economic competition, and work together where possible. But China has to be willing to play its part," end quote. Meanwhile, Chinese state media continues to publish articles highly critical of the US. There is no need for us here to consume too much. A taste should give us an idea of the themes and flavor. As always, these readings give us an idea of the worldview of Beijing elites and what they are presenting to their domestic audience. In a state-run Xinhua commentary called "On China, Washington Can't Have It Both Ways," the outlet writes this week, quote, "In its design, the United States wants, in the post-Cold War era, to manage China's development and turn the country into a junior partner. To put it simply, the Chinese should keep their feet on the ground and manufacture t-shirts and socks for American consumers, instead of trying to move up the smile curve. In its eyes, China's rapid rise was made possible by America, and Beijing should be grateful. However, in a highly integrated world, a complete US decoupling from China is as impossible as it is disastrous. Washington knows that quite well. For Beijing, Washington's condescending diplomacy is unacceptable. If Washington truly wants a workable relationship with China, it should treat China as an equal partner and show due respect," end quote. This week, China's former top envoy to the US, Cui Tiankai, gave an interview criticizing the US on its Taiwan policy, alleging, quote, "The US's attitude has changed. Today, the United States always says that it opposes unilateral changes to the status quo, implying that we are changing the status quo. However, originally, the United States promised to only have economic trade and cultural exchanges with Taiwan. But now, it has military and official involvement. Doesn't this change the status quo?" End quote. And yesterday, Thursday, state media writes that Taiwan was, quote, inviting wolves into their home, end quote, by hosting a US defense industry forum next week, and that, quote, the US military-industrial complex only seeks to export war for profit, end quote. Meanwhile, a new AmCham survey indicates that US companies are growing more pessimistic of the bilateral relationship. According to the survey published on Wednesday by the American Chamber of Commerce in China, some 87% of respondents surveyed last week in a flash poll said that they were at least slightly pessimistic about US-China ties, 14 percentage points higher than the previous poll. With the survey, the Chamber's chair of China Policy Committee expressed, quote, it's hard to see at this point when they will begin to improve, and this, of course, affects the ability of business to operate across borders, end quote. On Tuesday this week, a group of 9 Republican senators in the US urged the Biden administration to impose sanctions on Huawei Cloud and other Chinese cloud service providers, citing national security concerns. The following day, Wednesday, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said that Chinese cloud computer companies like Huawei Cloud and Alibaba Cloud, quote, could pose a threat to national security, end quote, and committed to review a request to add them to an export control list. As we go through all of this, we are reminded again, as we are normally almost daily, that the US-China relationship is at its worst point in decades, with some commentators increasingly warning of the risks of real conflict. But sometimes it's the small stories, symbolic of larger events, that hit the hardest and remind us just how bad things have become. A giant panda, Yaya, a traditional symbol of Chinese diplomacy and friendship, has been returned to China this week after 2 decades of being in the US. State media writes that 9 out of the 50 most popular hashtags on Thursday were related to Yaya. The hashtag Yaya has landed in Shanghai, for example, accumulated more than 500 million views within a few hours. US media outlet CNN spoke to visitors at the Beijing Zoo this week, where the panda will now live, reporting that an 11-year-old child expressed to them, quote, I've heard that the United States is treating the panda poorly, end quote, and an elderly man saying, quote, we should be more selective in giving pandas away in exchange of friendship. Why would we send them to unfriendly countries, end quote. Incredibly, the elderly gentleman even added, quote, pandas in Russia are very happy, you know. Why? Because Russians and Chinese are friends, end quote. This CNN report provoked an angry response from the state-run Global Times, which wrote today, quote, CNN claims that Chinese people's concerns about giant pandas is due to rising Chinese nationalism. This is politically correct nonsense, which aims at distorting the image of China and inciting the unhealthy mood and atmosphere towards China. Western media's demonization of panda diplomacy is essentially a need to suppress China in recent years, and it is also a typical manifestation of psychological distortion, end quote. Thus, even the pandas have been sucked into the worsening US-China relationship. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful Friday, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.